Today we're talking about scandal, not just as bad press, but as the church defines it, leading others into sin, especially from positions of authority. In practice, though, scandal often gets used to police appearances and enforce narrow roles, while real abuse of power is minimized, denied, or reframed as persecution. So, who actually pays the cost of scandal? The vulnerable or the institution? And what happens when simply living honestly before God is labeled as more dangerous than the systems that fail to protect people? Just a quick note, this episode does include discussions of clergy sexual abuse, grooming, and institutional misconduct within the church. While we do not go into graphic detail here, these topics may be difficult or activating for some listeners. Please take care of yourself and feel free to pause or skip this episode if necessary. You're listening to Whiplash, a listener-supported podcast exploring Catholicism through the lens of queer liberation theology. I'm Max Kuzma, a transgender man, columnist for the National Catholic Reporter, and board member of Dignity USA. Thank you to the paid subscribers who make this work possible. I'm joined today by Chris Damian and Justin Teltorst. I'm going to start by asking each of you to talk a little bit about how you define scandal and your experiences with that word in Catholic contexts. But first, I'll read a short bio for each of you. Let's start with Chris. Chris Damian is an attorney and writer. He holds a Juris Doctor and a master's degree in Catholic Studies from the University of St. Thomas and a bachelor's degree in philosophy from the University of Notre Dame. His work has appeared in Commonweal, Church Life Journal, Logos, the National Catholic Reporter, and other publications. He also writes at chrisdamian.substack.com. Chris, thank you for being here. What have your experiences of scandal been like? Big questions, just.
Yeah, I'm just full of endless scandal, just for fun. You asked first, how we define scandal. And I guess maybe for the purpose of this conversation, and also because my experiences of the concept of scandal are very predominantly in Catholic spaces. I will go to often who I go to, which would be Aquinas. He says that scandal is an act that's evil or has the appearance of evil that's an occasion for another's downfall. So basically something that looks like it's an evil act and that's an occasion for another sin. Now, like scandal isn't a cause for another sin. Only you can be the cause of your sin, says Aquinas. But within Catholic culture, more broadly, at least Catholic cultures, I had experienced it as someone who's very earnest, someone who's very theologically inclined in my adolescence and tended to surround himself with people who were also very theologically inclined, very inclined towards Catholic orthodoxy. I think for a lot of us, we viewed scandals as things which could create confusion or inappropriate understandings of what the church teaches and maybe encourage people to go along with those understandings or acts associated with those understandings. So I'll give maybe one example, which is, a lot of people have held and have been told by pastors and various Catholic leaders that going to a same-sex wedding is a scandal, even if you disagree with same-sex marriage, because you're giving people the impression that you support what they're doing. And even in my own personal life, I had a very close group of Catholic friends where I was dating someone in my early mid-20s, and I had told them that I wanted to be an Orthodox Catholic and be a good Catholic boy, including in my sexual life. But they had concerns about the relationship potentially leading to sex. And so when I invited that person's parents over for dinner with my household, half of my household chose not to come to dinner because they had thought that doing that would be a scandal. And I think that's very consistent with the popular understanding. I didn't really dive into what Aquinas had to say about scandal until later on, and partly as a result of experiences like that. And now that, I know that, actually Aquinas would not understand that as a scandal, partly because of the way in which I framed it. He says that scandal can be abated by kind of explaining what's going on, or by admonishing someone, But also, if it's not really an occasion for someone's downfall, it's not a scandal. So coming over to someone's house for dinner, if it's not leading you personally to sin, it's not an occasion for scandal. And actually, I would consider that like an act against charity, and potentially an occasion for scandal in other ways. All that is to say that you know my experience in Catholic culture, scandal tends to be associated with purity tests that are overly restrictive, often not actually consistent with Catholic teaching, and in a way, thing that people use to kind of keep their hands clean or to keep good appearances. And we definitely saw this throughout the clergy abuse crisis, where church leaders said that if we open up about this, it'd be a cause for scandal, and we can talk about this later if you want to. I'd also work with young woman, an elementary school teacher at a Catholic school here in the Twin Cities, who got pregnant, wasn't married, and then the school pushed her out of her job, had her sign a non-disclosure agreement if she wanted to keep health insurance during her pregnancy, and they saw it as a way of avoiding scandal in ways I actually think created other scandals. But that's kind of high level some of the issues involved.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's really I like that the way that your brain goes through it from the attorney perspective. I feel like you're like, here are the like good examples of different ways that this can manifest, which I think is exactly what I kind of want to get into here. So I'm really grateful that for what you shared. So Justin founded the nonprofit Empty Chairs in 2024 to help the Catholic Church live up to its call to treat the LGBT plus community with, quote, respect, compassion, and sensitivity, as per the Catechism of the Catholic Church 2538. He has over a decade of experience navigating church ministry, including 5 years as a missionary with Focus. Justin now works full time on Empty Chairs. His work includes creating educational and reflective content, meeting with individuals one on one, supporting parish leaders and ministers, and building networks of care and community for LGBT plus Catholics and those who love them. Justin, thank you for joining us. And what have your experiences of Scandal been like?
When I first like would one, I would say I love what you said, Chris. I'm like, I don't know if I have anything substantive to add here, but like the first thing that came to mind was like back in college, I was at a party and there happened to be some people who were drinking underage there. And like there were the Focus missionaries who were like, oh, well, we can't be here anymore because to be here would be to cause scandal. And I think, like, Chris, what your examples, when we talked about highlighted so much was this idea of just the subjective nature of it, of like what's going to cause scandal to one person is not going to cause scandal to somebody else. Like the things that I find scandalous of how certain platforms are or are not, commenting on stuff going on socially right now, to me is a cause for scandal. And so I think I think that's one thing that does need to be considered in this discussion is that we can throw our hands up in the air, especially the conservative Catholics that we know who can talk about scandal. That I think there's inherently this subjective nature that's going on in this discussion.
Yeah, and something that I think about, so I definitely think about the intricacies of the examples that Chris gave because, like, I went to Franciscan University and that was like always a conversation of like, well, I don't know if we could go to, that family member's wedding because of XYZ reason. It may be a same sex thing. It may be like, just like that person was divorced but not through canon law through the church, so there was like always some detailed plot twist of intricacy there. But I also think for me, it's interesting as a transgender person, because it's like transitioning is such a big change in your life, and there is a lot of sense of scandal associated with it in those types of more fundamentalist Catholic spaces. But what I found particularly frustrating about it, and this is a little bit of a tangent, I grant, but it was just frustrating that so many people would talk to me so much in those Franciscan years about like, oh, we want to be able to make friends with anybody. We want to be able to like, and back then it was, we want to like, it would be so cool to have a friend who's just like covered in tattoos. And I was like, I don't, why tattoos? It's like so random. um, but then like as soon as yeah, that says a lot about, it says a lot about
It's
the
so
culture
good.
of Franciscan.
It's so good.
But then as soon as I, transitioned, or as soon as I was like not part, like doing exactly what they were doing in that insular world, suddenly they didn't want to be my friend. And I felt like that was like, there's like some sort of double standard here where it's like we're supposed to be loving everybody, we're supposed to be welcoming everybody, but then now I'm just kind of like kicked out. Like, I don't know. Have you either of you had some sort of experience of that or like dealt with something like that?
I mean, I think the trans thing is such a good example, Max, because I think that I think a lot of Catholics would be like, basically, I can't have any relationship with you at all because partly I don't feel that I can address you by your name, because
Yeah.
that would be to suggest that I agree with transitioning, which could cause a scandal for others. And I do think that, it kind of just shows where some of this stuff leads, right? Where it's, if you hold these overly rigid views and have a preoccupation with scandal, which I think I think it's kind of related to scrupulosity,
Yeah.
it can actually do a lot to prohibit having relationships at all with a lot of people.
Yeah, I think the way that I've seen this like most consistently come up is like especially with friends who have a same-sex partner and they've got friends like Catholic friends that they've known oftentimes from college and they had like these super close friendships that had gone on for years and I'm in my early 30s, my friends are in their late 20s, early 30s and they've come out, they have a partner and they want to get together with their friends. And it's this always this awkward question of, oh, we can get together. And then asking like, well, can my partner come? And it's like the, well, and it's all the qualifiers. It's the, well, they can come up if they, if you just say you're friends or you can come, but I just was really inviting, wanting you to join. Like my child's going to be there. I don't want things to be confusing for them. And so I think like being with my friend through so many of those conversations and just the heartache that is experienced of like, I thought these people were super close friends. I thought that these were individuals that really cared about me, that we said we wanted to be lifelong friends together, and yet now there is this increasing division that is not caused by my friend, but it is caused by the fact that people in his life are continuing to step away for fear of causing scandal, for fear of showing approval in some capacity when it's just a matter of friends getting together, spending time together.
Yeah. Well, and you say that, it's not because of your friend, but I think a lot of those Catholics would say, oh, it is because of your friend, because your friend is choosing to
Yeah,
live their life in
exactly.
this way. And so they're choosing to end these relationships. And it really is like, can really kind of mess with your head when you're trying to navigate the complexities of your life and these relationships where maybe you don't even know fully what you think about them. I think about my past relationship where I was still figuring out how do I want to relate to it, and what does this mean, or what does this mean for my own kind of sense of fidelity to the church. But there were a lot of ways in which other Catholics related to me that I think cut off potential conversations and potential ways of thinking about it.
Yeah, no, totally. I was gonna say, like, so with the trans thing for me, that transition is not something that you can hide, right? Like, it's like if you decide to transition, it's going to affect your whole life, basically. Um, I'm curious for when it's the experience of deciding about your sexual identity, about coming out about your sexual identity. Did these issues of scandal feel like they were super relevant or like a fear of yours, or like did it come into play at all when you were in the process of coming out or figuring out how you wanted to come out?
I mean, yeah. When I was in the process of coming out, I was working for Focus, and so it was like my employment was on the line. Like it was like that was literally people I was living with, or people that I worked with. These were friendships. Like it was kind of like everything, my whole social circle, and so it was very much a measured. I'm going to come out kind of on my timeline so that I can have a new job lined up and I can get out of there okay. And it was very much this progression. But I think when I was first coming out, it was like, how do I do this in a way that makes people as comfortable as possible? So
Mm,
just being like, I'm still the same, nothing's changed. How the whole time, how do I put people as much at ease as possible? And I think over the years since then, kind of having to navigate friendships and relationships in a different way of being like, oh, I'm not just here to make you comfortable and happy. Actually, this is who I am. This is how I want to show up in a friendship and a relationship. And if somebody
mhm.
can't meet that, then, you know, then that's on
Yeah.
them.
Hmm.
Yeah, yeah, I definitely agree. I think for me, in terms of, thinking back to when I was, 22, 23, the extent to which a fear of scandal drove my own decisions, I already had so much fear. I had so much that I didn't have figured out that I wanted to figure out. I was struggling in so many ways. And so, I didn't need a concept of scandal to add weight to the already incredibly weighty things that I was working through. And so, and scandal did play a role, but it didn't play an internal role because I already had so many different things I was trying to juggle as I was wading through this complicated area of my life. But the way that scandal came in was, again, a fear of how others would treat me. It was a fear of losing relationships and things that added much more weight and much more angst to things that were already incredibly difficult for me. And, looking back, I think there are a lot of LGBTQ Catholics who have very similar experiences, and while I did have that weightiness, I also had various support systems that were helpful. But people who are in much more restrictive, confining uh, communities and social structures, to where eventually the weight just collapses on them. And to me, that seems like the far more grave scandal of people adding so much weight that eventually they can't carry the weight of their own experiences, and it can lead to despair, and it can lead to such a weightiness that they can't have any relationship to Catholicism in the future because it was so scandalized, because it was so traumatizing to them. Um, and so, I think there's all of this misuse of scandal, and Justin, you kind of touched on this too, where people use the concept of scandal to make your experiences about them, right? And it's yeah, and then looking back, me navigating my life and trying to work through the complexities of fidelity, it should not have been on those friends to make my experiences about their comfort. But that's so often what they did, and I think we see in a lot of Catholic communities.
Yeah, I also appreciate you, not to like go too far into this, but I appreciate that you kind of touched on this idea of the insular community-ness of it, like within this I'm surveilling myself, the scrupulosity piece, and then other people are surveilling me, like they're and then also tying that to what you both made the point of as it's kind of like the greater scandal to create this environment where people aren't actually able to freely be who they are, what I would say who God created them to be, like it's just interesting how those communities become so self-policed that it just feels like it's so outside of what they're trying to aim for, like and also it's outside, like how are you going to be evangelizing people, how are you going to get people to want to be part of this if the whole thing is like we're just this closed system where we are like all policing each other.
Well, I think that's partly why in a lot of these communities there is this kind of like encouraged codependency and lack of boundaries. I think that having good boundaries is one of the things that can help protect from scandal, because when you have good boundaries, you know that what I do and the choices that I make are about what I'm doing and the choices that I'm making. The choices that I'm making may not be the choice that you're making, and it's expected in normal human relationships that we're not going to all agree with everything that everyone's doing. But in a lot of these communities, there's an expectation that you're going to agree on every little thing, which is partly why I think people try to get into these little tiny nuances on moral questions and then universalize them, because there's comfort when you're not dealing in the ambiguity. But a refusal to deal with the ambiguity creates much more rigidity that needs to be enforced across the community. And it's something that I think makes scandal much more prevalent.
I'm also curious about the finding your way out part. So like
Yeah.
I spend a lot of time thinking about this because like and especially for people who are part of the LGBTQ community and who are raised in religious environments, you know, we already have this thing that makes us different that we are wrestling with that has more of a potential to make us think critically about like how the system is operating, I guess. Um and so I guess what I'm curious about is like I'm always curious about ways to help other people kind of find their way out. And I know like a big part of that is I think, in the witness of the way that we tell our stories. But I'm just curious if either of you have any reflections on that of what are some ways to help people start thinking about ways of, okay, maybe I don't need to be engaging in this rigid scrupulosity, maybe I don't need to be policing everything that I do, like that kind of stuff.
Yeah, Justin, I actually would be really curious to hear from you, just from your experience, because the experience of focus is so, like, being in that type of environment is so unique. I'd be curious, like, what was helpful in kind of stepping out of that? And
I do think so much of my background and so much of what happened to me before I did focus, like, kind of gave me the framework to be able to step out and not lose everything. Because, like, especially when I was a missionary, like in my first year and even like my last 2 years on college campuses, like on like as a student, I really made a point of talking with people and scheduling meetings with people who were totally outside the norm. So there was this
The
like,
tattooed person.
right, yes, but
Yeah.
actually, like, I remember sitting down and getting coffee with my like super atheist professor a couple times, and like in college, like I remember meeting with, I can't remember what the club was called, but it was just like this super sex positive like atheist club, and I know that's like such a terrible description of it, but it was like that was my perception of it, but it was like I just want to sit down and talk with these people, and so it was this experience of, oh, these are real humans who are here. And like, oh my gosh, they're sinners and they need to be saved and all these sorts of things. But I think for me, it was the starting point of, oh, these are real humans with real stories, and they're actually doing their best, and they're moving forward with a sense of morals, and they have a moral framework that's guiding how they're living. And this idea that the world is just completely corrupt and people are doing whatever they want to do. I just really struggled as someone who talked with hundreds and hundreds of college students on college campuses. Like, I really struggled to find someone who was genuinely like, I can just do whatever I want. There's no consequences, and I don't care about anybody. That was just a some image that existed on a talk at a Catholic conference, And then when I was in the process of coming out, everything that I had heard was coming out is empty, right? It is unfulfilling. It is shallow. You will be unhappy. And so I was like, okay, if this is what the church tells me to do, so if this is really true, I should see some evidence of this in the world. And so I was too scared to go meet people at this point. So I would like go work at Focus during the day, and I would come home and I'd read church documents and read psychology documents, and I would get on YouTube for hours on end and just watch testimonies, but essentially stories of LGBT people, and like, are they miserable? Are they actually happy? And certainly things can be airbrushed and edited and whatnot, but it's like, after watching, I don't know how many different stories of LGBT people who came out, and specifically non-religious individuals, I was like, there's like, these are people who are living good, happy, well-adjusted lives. These are not mentally disturbed individuals. And so I think it was, one, the curiosity to hear other people's stories, and then just the openness to see the good that exists in a life and a human who's disagreeing on a fundamental level, from what I believe. But yeah, I think maybe more importantly than that, I think this is super hard for Catholics, especially as someone who talks with Catholics day in and day out, is there has to be you have to trust yourself in some capacity, And I know that seems like it goes contrary to what we believe as Catholics, but like, I think of the lives of the saints, and I think of people who were trailblazers whose fundamental purpose was to understand who they are, how God was uniquely speaking to them, and how they were supposed to show up in the world. And you can't do that if you're just following a rubric, right? So many of the saints were pushing up against expectations and societal norms, and
And even the church.
yes, like there's just so, and they had to have a fundamental trust and understanding of who they were. And so I think, yes, look at the good, listen to other people's stories, but there has to be some cultivation and some understanding and some belief that you are fundamentally good, God trusts you, and you can trust yourself.
100%. Taking Emma's catchphrase there, her 100%. Chris, do you want to add something?
Yeah, I love all of that. And I don't know if this is your experience, Justin, but for me, I always grew up. I think of myself as someone who's always been a highly empathetic person, who's always been really gracious with other people, but then had a really hard time giving myself that graciousness and navigating the complexity of life. I think part of it came from um, being a bit of a maybe a moral perfectionist in ways that I found were not helpful over time. I think in terms of overcoming things, I think part of it was just at various times in my life, I had to confront very serious hypocrisies, had meltdowns because things weren't working. Partly just just even psychological meltdowns because of just carrying the weight of so many of these things in ways that were just not sustainable and, leading to despair in my own life. And I think going through that, partly, I just had to rethink things as a matter of survival, but then also to a certain degree as a matter of integrity. Some of the stuff that was also helpful for me to kind of work through these things was having done a lot of study of church history, doing a lot of thinking through, what is Catholic teaching, thinking through the fact that we've never had a catechism with this level of detail until the modern era that just didn't exist in the church. So there was much more of an expectation of working through the complexities of your moral life in the context of your own moral life with the help of an advisor that knows you well. And also meeting people from other Christian traditions, learning a little bit about apophatic theology, reading Sarah Coakley's work on the Holy Spirit, but then also doing virtue ethics. So studying Aristotle, MacIntyre. One of the books that it's so funny that really impacted me was Jonathan Lear. He actually, I think, died in the last year, but he was at the University of Chicago, studied a lot of Freud and Aristotle and virtue ethics, and a lot of Catholic thinkers as well. I think he studied quite a bit of Aquinas, but he has this view of one of the benefits of doing psychoanalysis. One of the ways to do psychoanalysis, he coins this term, this thing that he sees in Freud. It's called the teleological suspension of the real. He says that when you come in to see the psychoanalyst, the number one thing that you're trying to find is honesty with the psychoanalyst and honesty with yourself. And when you come in, he says that there can be value in suspending other values that you have for the purposes of your conversation with the psychoanalyst. So it might be your religious views or fears that religion might seem to want you to hold. Is that when you come into the therapist's office, it's helpful at times to suspend these other values so you can work on this value of honesty. And I found that to be helpful at times in my own life where I have moral concerns in one area, but something is not working in a really serious way in another. And I know that I need to work on this. So, at times I'll say, okay, I need to set those other things aside so I can work on this very serious issue that I'm seeing right now in my life. And giving myself that space along with kind of thinking through, what is the theology of sin and messages that I just think are not accurate that I've gotten from the church in terms of just what is sin was really helpful for me to kind of open up, give myself space, allow myself a certain amount of sinfulness while I'm working through these things, which is also incredibly humbling and I think made me much more gracious towards others as well. Um, Obviously, in case you can't tell, I'm like a very heady person, and I understand this processing is not normal. But those were just some of the things that were helpful for me.
No, totally. And I think some of the way that some of these communities or groups are structured, versions of Catholicism or communities of Catholicism, actually encourage that headiness and kind of like a
Mhm.
detachment from the semantic, the bodily experience. Because I relate to
Totally.
that too a lot, especially with the trans part, because like I just basically had to live entirely up in my head for so many years, basically 27,
Mm,
28 years before I started my transition, because I to be to be connected to my body was very painful because that's the experience of gender
mhm,
dysphoria. And so
mhm,
yeah, like I think that, yeah, like having to try to, for me, a lot of it was having to try to find a way to bridge as I went through the as I was going through transition. I was allowing myself to be open to the semantic, the bodily, the embodiment experience for the first time. And that brought like a lot of baggage because, oh, surprise, there was all this stuff that I hadn't dealt with for years and years and years as well. But it ended up becoming very beautiful in many ways because I not only was I finally getting to like meet myself, figure out who is the real Max, you know, who is this real person? Like I'd spent so many years feeling like I was sitting on the sidelines of so many people's lives, and I think this is something I wanted to bring up a little bit earlier too with all this intense attention on what is allowed and like what are they doing and am I allowed to be talking to them, I'm allowed to invite them to all this. It was like so complicated, and it did not allow for like the genuine person to person encounter like that. And that, again, the frustration that that's what they were always talking about is like, well, Jesus was out there encountering people, and it's like, well, you're not even a safe person to encounter what I truly feel like. You're over here like, you know, I had this one experience where I was working on a film project, and one of the friars from Franciscan University was involved in it. And I kid you not, like, you know, I was just showing up to work that day, and he like singled me out, and he kept asking me, how are you, like over and over again through the conversation, like was not satisfied with my answer. And that was such a common thing for me in those years too, because I know that everybody was aware that there was something different about me, and I knew there was too, but I was like, but I'm doing the right thing, like why are you guys like scrutinizing me? I'm not doing anything. Like why is just my existence like a problem? Like why are you like probing me with this? Who are you? Yeah.
Wait, can I jump on that tangent slightly? Of like, I don't know if you had the question, like, how's your heart? Like, there was almost this entitlement of because we are brothers and sisters in the Lord, right? That I am then entitled to know the deepest, darkest secrets.
Exactly.
And like a big thing for me coming out was like learning boundaries in all fields, and being like, oh, like friendship requires me to learn like where somebody is at and closeness to me. And by virtue of that relationship or that closeness or the trust that's been built up, like then they deserve to hear this part of my life or that part of my life or this really meaningful thing.
Well, and I wanted to connect that too. You know, I think for me, intellectually, intellectually, you know, another really important piece for rethinking Scandal for me really was studying and diving into and finding responses to the clergy abuse crisis, right?
Mm,
Because the concept of Scandal was so central to the messages supporting a lack of transparency, but then also to your point, Justin, the there's just another way in which um, a hyper lack of transparency, especially when it comes to one's sins and one's vulnerability, is it can be grooming behavior, right? And
mm-hmm.
so were a lot of environments where priests would encourage that, especially with young people that they were going to abuse. You know, they would encourage this, you know, now looking back, we can see an inappropriate degree of vulnerability where there weren't enough safeguards, maybe not the appropriate relationships. And as a church, we haven't really thought through this because we carry that dynamic today still into a lot of ministries, right? We now know that that's not appropriate typically on the part of priests, but we still send people to the net retreat where it's a 14-year-old boy that's encouraged to tell a 21-year-old ministry leader that they struggle with masturbation and to share that in a circle, right? And in the priestly context, we know that's grooming behavior, so we should be concerned, but we're not sufficiently concerned about that in other areas, which to me is maybe a bigger scandal.
I want to talk more about like putting people in that vulnerable position because it is a weird thing, and not equipping people because
Yeah,
I think
totally.
that's one of the big second parts.
Yeah, so this is, I mean, common for grooming behavior, especially when like there's a teacher with students or like a older family member with children. Um, One of the things that they'll often do, and a lot of times it's combined with alcohol use, but not always, is they'll get secrets from the person that they want to abuse. And secrets gives you access to their internal life and to their vulnerability. And also, if you can get secrets from them, you can use that as a door to share things that are lewd about yourself or inappropriate. So then you're kind of creating a pathway
I
for
see.
this sharing of information, and then you can hold on to that information as a form of power. To then, when the person is abused, then you can hold the secrets over them as a way to keep them quiet about what's been going on. And that was, I mean, very common. And I mean, you can read that throughout like the Pennsylvania grand jury report. It's a story that happens over and over again. And a lot has been done, I think, to inhibit that dynamic with priests. Obviously, a lot of people are concerned about ways in which this could happen in the confessional, which, unfortunately it has happened. And so it's not an unfair concern. But we are not attentive to the ways in which these dynamics are very much encouraged and are structurally a part of a lot of ministries in the church that work with youth, especially things like net.
Yeah. Yeah, I think the part that's standing out to me the most is um, I just feel like I really resonate with a lot of what Justin was saying about trying to learn boundaries or understanding what boundaries would be or could be like. Because yeah, it just felt like for me before, when I was in this more insular fundamentalist type of spaces, it felt like for me, for example, there was this idea that we had to just kind of blanketly trust anybody else who was in this
Mm,
Catholic group. Like
sure.
like really blanketly trust. Like those were the people that, would be prioritized for social stuff, certainly, but also even for professional needs. Like I always use this example because it is kind of absurd, but my dad would always say, like, if you need like a car mechanic, you need to find the one who is like the Catholic, the right kind of Catholic car mechanic, which, I, yeah, it was just this whole
I
thing of
totally know
like,
what you're saying, though. Yeah.
I think it was less of like, it wasn't like it was really, this is our network, these are our people, so like these are the people we go to like, figure things out or whatever. But anyway, I think that that level of just blanket trusting all of these people, like it was so hard for me to like learn. Well, first of all, I grieved a lot when I lost it because like
We,
I think you mentioned codependency as well, like this enmeshment in this thing where we're all like super oversharing about everything, but then everything's really intense. It's kind of like a toxic relationship that like is toxic, but when you get out of it, you're kind of like, man, like the highs were so high though. Like there's a little bit of that,
the classic
Um,
toxic relationship. Yeah.
yeah,
That's
exactly. Exactly. And so it's been so I think when I'm reflecting on what you're sharing about this, I'm just thinking of my own journey of like, yeah, like getting to the point where I was able to understand. Because I think the biggest thing was with boundaries was understanding the speed of relationships, because that's the thing. In that Catholic world, it was
mm,
supposed to be just instant, like, oh, I found you're a Catholic, okay, do you go to, what church do you go to, like making sure you go to the, like, you're not going to the hippie mass, you're going to like the serious one, not necessarily Latin, but like you're, a serious Catholic. And then as soon as I know that about you, now I just completely trust you. Like
mhm.
that's just like not how real life
Yeah.
works.
Well, and I think this ties back to the concept of scandal, right? Because you're in these environments where there's um, a very heightened feeling of vulnerability because you are encouraged to share these deepest, darkest parts of yourself, but you have to frame them in a certain way to be acceptable to the community.
Yeah.
And then scandal is one of the ways in which you push people into those rigid frameworks and ways of thinking and talking about this stuff. Right. And I think something like masturbation is a really good example. In these communities, you are encouraged as a male growing up, or like as someone who is in kind of male masculine environments, you are encouraged to share that you struggle with masturbation. And at the same time, you are encouraged to, when you share, talk about how you think it's bad. And there's an expectation that you're doing it, but you're constantly also apologizing for it, right? And any questioning of that or saying, well, maybe it's not a big deal, that's filtered through messages of how this could be a scandal. So then you get this sense of vulnerability, but it's actually a mask because it's hiding various ways in which you want to talk about it. So you feel like you're hyper connected, but it's within a framework of control that the concept of scandal helps to hold up.
Really well said. What you were just talking about, Chris, made me think of um about like how so this idea of like brotherhood that is like tied to it's when the group, like, you have to be completely bought in on everything in every area of your life to remain in the brotherhood, into the community, into the group. um and because I always contrast this in my mind with something like martial arts, where martial arts is something that has, there's values that are important in martial arts. Like, there are things that there's sportsmanship, right? There's like, so it's not the same as like ethics or morals exactly, but there is like a structure that you're participating in. So like, you are agreeing to certain terms, right, when you participate in martial arts. But when you leave the martial arts studio, you're not taking all of those, like, it's not still like, it's not like we are going to scrutinize every single area of your life. Like, every single thing that you do has to be put through the lens of, does this make you the correct martial arts uh participant or whatever. Do you know what I mean? Like, I'm not explaining this very well, but it's like that contrast of like, what is a healthy way to participate? Because I think we spend so much time talking about like, and for us, unpacking what we went through, which is really important. But I also try to like think through, okay, so what are the healthy models that do exist,
Mhm.
I think like one thing that I'll add to this to maybe bring it to listeners who are like, oh, I don't see this happening. Like, we're not doing crazy like masturbation men's talks, or, is I think like when I was a missionary, like the framework that we had was, well, like, this is a lonely world. We're going on college campuses and like these people are so lonely. And I think that there was a little bit of a practical, like, where do we go find the lonely people? But then um, using that as our inroad, well, we're just trying to foster connection. We just want to be connected with individuals, and then feeling how conditional those all were, because kind of like what both of you were talking about was, you are welcome in this community. There's a place for you. You belong. Taking advantage of, especially those freshmen who don't have connections. You can come on this retreat. You belong if you show up in the right way, if you use the right language, if you follow the right coding, and it, I think, becomes then this feedback loop of, I want to belong here. Oh, I'm experiencing community. I have to say the right things. I have to do the right things. If I'm questioning those things, then I don't belong. So I must believe those things. And I think that there's real community, right? There's real friendships that come out of this. That's not all terrible and horrible and things like that. But I think that cycle of like worry of rejection, of the right language connection, just can continue on for so many people, until I think a lot of people get out of college and it's like, what the heck was that? At least that was my experience leaving leaving being a missionary finally.
I also wanted to ask you, Justin, about something that I think you made maybe a reel on Instagram about, or you've talked about before, which is like the idea of a celibate gay priest as
Mm.
more scandalous than, other things that are going on in the church. I was just curious if you could, like, I know this is a little bit of a tangent from what we were just talking about, but that was something that I wanted to hear more from you about. Like, I liked your reel, and if you could unpack that a little for us.
Yeah, I think so many in the Catholic Church have done a fantastic job of associating being gay with having sex. And I would say that this comes from within the Catholic Church, that if you are gay, this is the pinnacle of sin in the world. Like, this is moral deprivation, right? This is the destroying the traditional family, right? It is an abomination of the way God intended, right? These are the things that I've heard literally in homilies. And so I think that there is such an association with being gay, having sex. That is what these people are. And I think on another level, there's certainly been this resurgence of this false psychology narrative that's coming. Like literally, I've been emailing a priest this morning from the Legionaries of Christ. I'm totally throw him under the bus there for a second, who was giving me all the psychology of why it was wrong to be gay, and because he's like, hey, we have to draw from Catholic anthropology. This is the correct way to be filtering the sciences. If we're not drawing from Catholic anthropology, then we can't trust what the sciences are saying. And I was just wanting to be like, what are you doing? So I think we've got this language that gay is having sex. We have this framework that is being, imposed on the church by a very small subset of Catholics saying, if you are gay, it's because you don't know how to relate to people properly. It's because you're psychologically disturbed. And so then if your priest comes out, it's like, he's having sex. He doesn't know how to relate to people. He's psychologically disturbed. And so I think it is this huge scandal. It's this moral scandal of sexual impropriety. It is this question of pastoral ability, this question of ability to be a spiritual father. And I wonder if maybe part of the reason why there's an ability to almost overlook, I think there's two reasons why people can overlook the systematic failure to address abuses. I think one, the people who saw it for the scandal that it is left the church. I know so many people that I've talked to who are like, this happened in my diocese, in my parish. I'm not Catholic. I can never go back. And so I think the reason why there's not the outrage in some places is because those people were outraged and they left. And it's like, and so people who don't hear those voices, who are living in those bubbles, not engaging with people outside of their Catholic circles, are just ignorant to the profound gravity of the harm that like I have never been in a church or like close to a church or diocese where this has happened, but I have sat with people in those stories, and I can't even put it, like, it is heartbreaking for what has happened. So I think that's one. But I think two, people can just write it off as, well, this is a systematic failure, right? This is just the system wasn't working the way it was supposed to. Flawed human beings, God works through, broken instruments or whatever. And so the church is supposed to do better, but this is just a failure of the institution, not the huge moral failure that it actually is. So that's why I think there are so many reasons, but those are some of the bigger ones.
Yeah, I also think, a little bit over what you were saying too, and this is something that I've been thinking about in this whole conversation, is like the way that priests are positioned as this spiritual authority that is so detached from us. Like it's like it has to be this elevated, they have to have this almost superhuman or supernatural, ethos or reputation about them in order to like have this in order to justify the spiritual, abilities that are, do you know what I'm trying to say, like part of the structural nature, like a little bit maybe like of clericalism too.
Mhm. Yeah. Well, even like I love the post-Vatican II church in so many ways, and like just
Same.
go talk to your priests who are in their 70s and 80s. Please learn from them. Hear what actually happened, right? But one of the changes in the church was to move the priest back, or not back, but to move the priest to the center of the altar and replace Jesus. And it was, the intent of that was, I think, to remind priests and the laity of like the church acting in persona Christi. But I think for so many priests, it put them on a throne in the middle of the church again, And I think we're coming off of the pre-Vatican II church, where you had this super high liturgy, where you had priests really held up as just these like crazy
Untouchable
authority figures. Yeah, these untouchable figures. And so I think that the priests that they kind of got what Vatican II was getting at understood that was not to like elevate them. It was to elevate them in the moment of the Mass, and that they were just one of the congregation, right? The whole reason why you would have people facing each other, right? The whole reason why you would move the choir to be a portion of the congregation, because they weren't just these people in the back of the church, but they were part of the worshiping body as well. And so like this whole movement to do ad orientem, I get it. There's a place for it. There's a beauty to it. But I think it's just now reinforcing this idea of priests are untouchable, priests are other. And I think it's just contributing to the real distance that's happening because priests aren't better than us. Like they're still humans, right? They have a particular vocation. They have a leadership role in the church, but they are also one of us in the church struggling to understand who we are and how we're called to follow God.
It's funny that y'all like, oh, like the post Vatican II church, and I'm like, I love the church of the 1200s, and I do think it's actually really helpful to have when you have a very broad view of church history and how the church operated. Because if you think about the church that like Francis of Assisi grew up in,
Yeah.
it
No,
was
totally.
just the expectation that like the priests were probably not the best people, and like they're sexualized. I mean, it was just kind of like widespread that like priests were not particularly holy, and that was part of the crisis of the church that Francis was stepping into. But which I mean, I don't think that's ideal. But one of the things that can help prevent are certain types of abuses when you would have an assumption of perfection that can be leveraged as power, right? And when I think about kind of again come back to this view of scandal, we have this view of the priest has to be perfect in all of these ways, which I think in some ways is reinforced by acknowledgement of the clergy abuse crisis. And there's this fear that if there is any imperfection, that the priest is just going to slide into hedonism or abuse. And obviously, same-sex attraction is going to be one of the ways in which that can come up. And so there's this desire for certain types of measurable or comfortable purity that a lot of Catholics want to have that give them a sense of security, but that in reality is not actually helpful for preventing things like abuse and can reinforce harmful structures of power within the church. I also think there's something about, and you kind of brought this up a little bit, Justin, this idea, the connecting of queer people with sex, especially connecting of gay men with sex. As there are a lot of Catholics that just can't make that disconnection. So you're hypersexualized as soon as it becomes apparent that you experience same-sex attractions, or even if you're gay and celibate. And I don't think it's entirely dissimilar from the sexualizing of people of certain races and the way in which purity culture does that as well. I think about the conversations that I've had with a lot of especially brown and black women who are curvy as teenagers and were trying to conform with Catholic school guidelines around like skirts, and how if you were curvier, skirts would kind of just ride up in different ways. And it was uniforms were physically like the garments were structured in a way that made meeting the purity test harder if you had that body type, and that body type tend to be racialized. So there's something in this like the purity culture that sexualizes certain races, and then also that sexualizes queer experiences in ways that are not helpful for either queer people or the church at large.
And then the double standard of like people who are getting automatically sexualized and we can't touch that, meanwhile like everyone is like secretly dealing with their own sexualities anyway, like
Oh,
it's just always happening anyway. I also, that's man, there's like four other probably podcast conversations just in like what you just said, Chris, but I just have to throw out there how it is especially interesting being trans in this environment, because so many people like, and this speaks more to the, because these things are sexualized, or queer identities are sexualized or seen as like bad or immoral or scandalous, then we don't learn about them or know about them. So people are like, well, so you're trans, but like who are you attracted to? And I'm like, that is not the same thing. Like there's a difference between sexual orientation and gender identity. And we don't have time to unpack all of that in this exact moment, but yes. So as we get closer to the end of our conversation here, um, is there anything, I know there's so many directions again that we could go, but is there anything in specific we haven't touched on, or something from what we've spoken about that you think deserves like a little additional word to add to round out this conversation?
yeah, I want to touch on just one other part of Aquinas' discussion of the concept of scandal, which I think is really important. So Aquinas talks about people who are kind of the recipients of scandal. He says you can be a recipient of scandal, I mean, in at least two ways. one of the ways is, you can be your sin can be occasioned by observing an appearance of evil on the part of another. One, because you're weak or ignorant. Um, so that's one thing. Like if I lead someone else into scandal, then there's an interesting thing of like it's actually not a sign of necessarily my own weakness or depravity. It's actually a sign of their weakness. So me changing my behavior to help them avoid that is actually an act of charity. And Aquinas says that, we shouldn't necessarily avoid, well, at times we can forego certain spiritual or material goods in order to not be an occasion of scandal for that weak or ignorant person. But there's a second way in which you can be scandalized, and that's being scandalized out of malice. And Aquinas says that that's what happens when the Pharisees are scandalized by Jesus's teaching. And so there are some people that are just committed to being scandalized by you, by whatever you do, even when you're doing good things. And Aquinas says that for those people, you should not forgo any goods because they're not worth changing your behavior in order to avoid their scandal because they're so committed to scandal. And I think that's really helpful for a lot of Catholics and a lot of LGBTQ Catholics, because a lot of us exist in communities that are just committed to being scandalized by what we do regardless. And I think for those people that are committed to being scandalous, I would follow Aquinas and say that they are not worthy of you making changes to your life.
Hit that block button on
yeah.
social media.
Yes.
What about you, Justin? Any final words?
Oh man. I don't know. I think that kind of maybe bringing it back to the whole human level, I think that for so long there was this fear of causing scandal by coming out in certain religious contexts, but providing caveats and whatnot. And I think getting to a place of, I don't believe I am living in defiance of the church. I believe I am living in the deepest congruence of what I believe the church to teach and the deepest congruence of who I understand God to make me. And so I think that from that place is a place of not worrying so much about causing scandal. Like, yeah, I worry because I worry too much. But I think that being grounded, yeah, I worry way too much. But I think being grounded in one's identity, I think in those times when I have people that I know and they're like, this is what are you doing? How can you be doing this? Whatever it is, then I think that there is that greater freedom to point to what you were saying, Chris, of that is their decision. That is their reaction. I am at peace with who I am and how I understand God to make me, and how they react is on them.
Well, thank you both so much. I really appreciated this opportunity to talk through this with you, especially because, like, it is always just so. I always just feel seen and validated by hearing other queer people who come from a Catholic experience talking about what this feels like. And so I have one final thing for each of you, which is just tell the people where to find you, and if there's anything you want to promote, like anything that you recently came out with that you want to direct people to.
You can find me at the social media places at EmptyChairs Home. You can go to my website where there's some stuff that I've written, empty-chairs.org. And if you go to my YouTube, I'm finally putting out some more longer form content. So I think it's like Thursday and Sunday are my publishing schedules. So go check that stuff out.
Yeah, likewise. So at C. Damian Writes, most social media platforms, Instagram, YouTube, Spotify, etc. Yeah, I mean, I would say that probably my home base is going to be either my Substack, my YouTube podcast, or my Instagram, where I also host a lot of interesting conversations around the church on a range of questions. And I always love hearing from people.
Scandal is supposed to be about protecting people from harm, especially the most vulnerable, not protecting power, image, or influence. If we're going to use that word seriously, we have to apply it consistently, even when it might be uncomfortable. Thank you both for helping us think more clearly and more honestly about what scandal really is, who it impacts, and what accountability might look like in the body of Christ. And to everyone listening, stay thoughtful, stay grounded, and I'll see you next week on Whiplash.